With the marker signal more intimately familiar with the human nervous system as well as human genetics, it would begin pushing mutations well past the point of your standard slasher and into the territory of more experimental creatures for several reasons. Initially, a marker would begin altering the neuronal connections within the brain, causing depressive episodes in the temporal and occipital lobes, as well as likely the frontal lobe with the inability to control emotions. As the replicating signal went deeper and deeper into the tissue of the body, with the person being exposed to it on Aegis 7, they would begin to hallucinate and see monsters everywhere, causing them to attack one another, resulting in biomass availability rising. As people began to openly war in the streets with one another and an all-out kill or be killed combat would begin to emerge out of nothing but pure fear, another creature would arise that humans couldn't deal with, and this would be known as the slasher. The slasher utilized naturally occurring structures within the human body, such as bone that was honed and sharpened that could impale and dismember quite easily, leading to more biomass to build up. However, if it ended here, the Brethren Moons and the markers would not be successful. It is well known at this point that there are a few issues with the Brethren Moon's plans that either they didn't account for, or that may just be a natural answer to the Brethren Moons that they cannot actually correct, and this is known as human intellect as well as the human spirit. It is clear that the Brethren Moons see every species they assimilate as nothing more than farm animals. Entire cultures, worlds, species, whatever, are all meant to be used in the creation of a moon-sized creature whose only purpose is to grow their own network of other moons and wipe clean the galaxy. How far exactly they go is unknown, and it could be a universe-wide event. Given the size of the universe, it could even be an entirely new ecosystem setup where things arise as gigantic horrors to us, but are very much so a part of a food web. We just happen to be comparable to like the plankton of the sea, the very basis of the food web fueling larger predators. I mean, look at from the perspective of ants. Humans are like eldritch giant creatures with just completely unknown motives and wants and needs that we can just kind of destroy an entire, I guess you could say, world of ants without even really trying. So, I mean, something bigger than us isn't really that hard to think of. But whether that is or isn't the case is irrelevant, and it's a complete unknown for the time being. So the Brethren Moons are just potentially the apex predator of this galaxy, but that does not stop life from evolving and adapting. Much like with viruses attacking bacteria in the ocean every day, wiping out over 70% of all bacteria in the ocean, life does not just allow itself to be taken out so easily, despite how successful viruses are. Bacteria answered this aggression from viruses with their own survival technique, known as CRISPR and the Cas9 protein complex. I know, right? Anything to mention my favorite alpha Chad gene editing tool. But to connect it, in case I sound like a madman, this is essentially what human intellect and willpower is to the Brethren Moon's onslaught. Countless species have been assimilated into the giant meatball in the sky that gives everyone spicy thoughts. But when coming across humanity, it became clear something else was needed to truly overrun this hominid. This is likely due to life's natural compulsion to continue and not just be an end result for something else. Because of this, although the human species coming into being was brought on by the black marker and its influence over the planet, a shred of originality still remained within life on this planet from its original being. You can imagine it being something like if humans were made out of 10 parts. 9 of those parts are influenced by the Brethren Moon, but 1 part is influenced by the original genetics in the evolutionary chain that allowed for life to continue after the black marker hit the Yucatan Peninsula 65 million years ago, wiping out the dinosaurs. This 1 part of influence does not appear to be present in the Tau Volantians, seeing as the Volantians, actually within like their species and the Necromorphs that they formed, do not appear to be kind of different from one another. It just appears to be one form of Necromorph. So, although this should be taken with a grain of salt because the sample size is quite small and the interaction between humans and the Tau Volantian Necromorph was incredibly sparse. But when dealing with humans, another countermeasure was needed apart from just hallucinations and slasher creation, and again, this was due to human survival instincts and intelligence displayed by humans, and also our willpower, again, known as the human spirit. What I find most interesting about this aspect is, again, if the Tau Volantians are anything to go off of, they stayed on their planet. They were clearly advanced enough to go to the stars, seeing as they built a machine that would basically freeze one of these moons in place and require like an incredibly high amount of technology as well as like gravity wells that they created on their planet, yet there was nothing found from them like apart from their home planet. Humanity, on the other hand, has spread across the galaxy at the point of making like a fundamental difference between potentially how our 2 species viewed the galaxy. Tau Volantians may have decided there was no place like home, while humans took a very literal mindset to the kind of the idea of the stars are ours. Either way, the mindset appears to be a defining line between what the Brethren Moons must do to conquer a species and assimilate it. Should humans have been approached with only slashers and hallucinations, it is entirely possible there would have been enough humans to resist the influences to turn the tide and overwhelm the Brethren Moons. Mainly because I have headcanon that, you know how you have to like tear apart a necromorph? I was so sure Dead Space 4 was gonna have you using basically a planet cracker ship to tear apart a Brethren Moon to incapacitate it. It would have been like poetic. But anyways, if energy is coming from say nowhere, and this is in terms of the markers, that means it can be tracked. The only issue would be stopping the signal, which at this point we appear to have learned how to do this, considering we had a marker on the moon without the city around it succumbing to kind of the effects of it, until Danik ended up being a turbo douche and blowing it up, releasing the signal. But there are those who were able to either imperfectly resist this signal by being more intelligent than say the others around them, or having a fair amount of willpower, such as Isaac, or possibly even Carver to an extent, who may not have the intellect, but had enough fortitude to push through the alteration of his mind, to those that appear outright immune, such as Ellie, which I've actually done a video on her if you're interested, to those who were not only immune, but were also a direct threat to the Brethren Moon by creating a field of influence that could bring others out of their psychosis just by being near them, such as Lexi and Weller. There appears to be a specific set of sequences needed for all these to come into play, but the takeaway is this: being smart is not enough, as we will come to find out. It would require a specific blending of personal traits as well as being the unluckiest lucky person in existence, which is pretty much Isaac. So to answer this issue, which is something the Brethren Moons could never fully account for as it's added in the randomness of life, because remember, the Brethren Moons seek to corrupt what is already established. They do not have a hand in creating life. They would alter the human form into a more horrific visage that other species did not appear to have to contend with. However, from what it would appear like, specific traits of the human body would be incorporated into these alterations as the body's natural composition was accounted for, and they would be used to fulfill a purpose. To this end, in today's episode, we will be taking a look at the Dividers in Dead Space Remake. Along with this, let's discuss their physiological changes and why these specifically seem to crop up within a very small sect of crew members on the Ishimura, as well as discuss the neurology, or forced neurology, behind the end of Isaac being on Team Human and joining Team Necromorph, because sweet Mary, Mother of God, is that just absolutely disturbing to witness. Although obviously quite interesting if you watch it from a distance. A Divider Necromorph is an incredibly rare variant of Necromorph. There may be several reasons for its reality, but the first reason is that given what it is wearing, it appears to be an officer's garb. From here, we can ascertain that this was a high-ranking member of the crew, which means just by natural hierarchy standards, they're going to be less plentiful. Along with this, as we come to find out later when Kendra and Hammond get to the bridge, there were no survivors, which is likely where most of the officers of the ship would have been at the time of the Necromorph attack, and this is integral to understanding why they are so rare. When Isaac gets himself to the bridge, a brute attempts to burst through the window, appearing to have been trapped in the security station. It's likely that quite a few officers who were still alive at this point would have taken shelter in there with security, attempting to seal themselves off from what was happening outside the doors. From here, it's pretty clear what happened. One, or possibly even a few of them, would succumb and give into the madness and begin attacking their fellow officers. From here, everyone within this room would be torn apart as tissue was reanimated into the brute. We know this takes several bodies to accomplish, which is likely where most of the officers went. The rest likely scattered across the ship in an effort to survive. Many would likely have become the corruption, like others in the ship, as they formed the coating on the walls as well as the Leviathan. But a few would be cursed beyond measure, depending on who you ask, because really, they were kind of all screwed in some form or fashion. The ones who did not get turned into a brute or some meat paste on the wall would become a wailing, shrieking creature that resembled a human form, and this may have actually been on purpose to confuse others. Their lithe appearance would allow them to cover running distances just by walking, and when incurring enough damage, their body would break apart in a thing-inspired way that would then continue to hunt down survivors, and in some ways, could completely take over their bodies. But the question is, why did they become the way they were? And to answer this, we need to first take a look at their morphological structures, as this will give us some clues as what may have happened to their bodies and why they are in the shape that they are. So you know what this is, and you know why we're here. Starting with the feet, we can see some fairly interesting changes. First, the feet are there in some original form. They have 4 toes now instead of the standard 5, with splits forming on the left foot, possibly from damage, but there could be a multitude of reasons to explain how this has happened. The skin is ashen and gray with meat clearly visible. Moving up the foot, the ankle is now gone. Instead, it has been replaced with a long, sinewy tendril that appears to actually hold up the body. But what's interesting is when following these, you can see an exposed tibia and fibular bone that has been clearly snapped. This is the original connection point of the ankle, obviously, as the skeleton was not able to keep up with the growth. But there's also something else it could be. We'll talk about that in a moment. But this implies the feet were either forcibly severed by something, attacking it, or the growth of the tendrils caused the feet to separate off of the legs, giving the creature a height advantage and giving hope to the short kings everywhere. Following the legs up to the knee, it appears to just be your standard configuration, as it would appear that the meat of the quadriceps and pelvic region was used in the creation of the tendrils in the leg, giving them a much more lithe appearance as the pants hang loosely on them, and the pelvis is clearly seen as kind of a desiccated state. Like the pants, it does not look like there's a lot of meat left in the pelvis. That sounded kind of bad. But not much is known of the pelvic region, as the pants have thankfully stayed intact, although I would imagine, given the Brethren Moons care very little for anatomical importance, everything has been reused. Except for some reason in Dead Space 2, where the slashers were double cheeked up on a Tuesday afternoon. Shout out to Dead Space Necro posting on Facebook for just being a giant continued meme. Absolutely hilarious nonsense over there. Anyhow, you know who's not cheeked up? The Divider. As we move to the abdominal area, we see that the intestines of this creature are completely gone. This could be for several reasons, but mostly given that all the tendrils of the creature now possesses and the complete lack of intestines, I think these are in fact possibly the intestines in some capacity. As we all know, intestines are not just there to hang out and look weird during surgeries. They are what are known as smooth muscle and have a purpose. So you have like cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, and smooth muscle, and should this muscle be corrupted by, I don't know, a multi-trillion ton meat patty warping through space, they can be used to move around and grab things, much like voluntary skeletal muscle, which is exactly what I believe is happening. The intestines appear to have moved to different areas of the body, grabbing the furthest areas of the limbs and separating them and taking over that function of the upper limbs, and for a good reason, which we'll get to here momentarily. It's clear not only has the abdomen been cleared out, but the spine has also been severed just behind the abdominal aorta, and where that would be sitting, and it's held up by these tendrils, which, again, it gives credence to an idea that I have later, but it kind of shows, I think, what is happening overall, and it kind of leans towards one side versus the other, but we'll get there. But this will give them an ungainly walk, as it no longer is bone holding up the creature's two halves, but simply the intestines thrusting into the thoracic region and into the chest cavity. And we can see this feature exiting out of the sides of the chest in between the ribs. So here's the interesting thing. You would never really think of it this way, but our skeletons are simply there to provide support for our body, which skeletal muscle uses as a basis to move at the direction of the nervous system. The skeleton is a puppet that we manipulate and move, and it serves other purposes, like with white and red bone marrow creating white blood cells and red blood cells respectively. Which, fun fact, did you know if you jumped off something really high and broke your femurs, you would lose possibly up to 3 liters of blood? And this is why femur fractures are so dangerous. Actually, I used to date a girl for like 3 weeks back in college. I think she told me she had her Jeep roll over her pelvis, if I remember correctly. It's amazing that she could walk, but that can hold up to 4 to 6 liters, but during a break, it can lose around 1 to 2 liters. Yeah, apparently she almost bled out with that one. Wild to think that you can actually come back from that with modern technology now. Like, I seriously don't know how she survived that. But anyhow, apart from that side tangent, as we move to the shoulders, we see it's your typical kind of just standard connection point with really no muscle mass to speak of. This will continue down to the biceps and triceps, as this officer was in no way focused on getting yoked. In the immortalized words of Ellie, nerd, figures. However, around the top portion of the radius and ulnar bone, just inferior to the elbow, we can see that they are completely exposed. It would appear that the intestines have grabbed this area of the forearm and just snapped it off completely. It is instead fused with the wrist of the Divider, causing the arms to almost triple in length as a result of this new fusion and connection point. Moving down to the hands, we do see there is great potential in the idea that while the bones do not increase in length, the tendons, ligaments, and muscles have taken over this functionality. The fingers are there mostly in their normal form, but it's clear the palm of the Divider has increased to around double its normal size. The thumb is around 3 times its normal size, with the pinky and ring finger being around probably twice the length as well. Interestingly, the middle and index finger have quadrupled in length, as well as fused around the third knuckle. This fusion is likely added to the extensor tendons and flexor tendons together, which run on the back and front of the phalanges respectively to open and close the hand. Because of the lack of bone growth we see in the rest of the body, it is highly unlikely that the bone has increased in length, and instead, the intestinal growth now bridges these gaps using bones as more of a jumping off point. But I guess maybe the intestinal growth could be more viewed as tendon growth and ligament growth. It should also be noted that the intestinal growths appear to be exploratory in nature, like a vine looking to attach to a fence or a wall, given that we see one exiting out of the palms of the Divider, looking for more material to fuse to. And this is highly important for its purpose later. Moving back up to the head, we get to the real dangerous growths. While this thing can swing at you wearing full rig armor, it would do kind of not really that much damage. Now, a normal human with just clothing on, it still might hurt enough to knock you out, and then it's completely game over. Something to also remember is with its longer arms comes more leverage, and when swinging that arm comes more speed, with more force imparted to the impact site. Anyhow, back to the head. These people's heads will sit about a foot above the body. Much like how the limbs were separated from the body, the intestines have wrapped around the spinal cord and completely separated, pushing the head high above the body, which is now completely supported by these tendrils. Once again, this highlights that it's not really the brain in control of the body, but the marker signal itself. The brain still appears to be sort of like a hub of some sort, which we'll see here momentarily, but the body is operated by the pre-hive mind to move, as well as the intestinal growths all over the body, operating it much like a meat suit. A large central tendril comes out of the mouth, which can be assumed to be the esophagus of the person, and it's fairly strong to boot. The face is gray and lifeless with damage like all over it, and with no hair on its head, with the jaw completely severed, having made room for this tendril. It is also assumed these tendrils enter where the brainstem was holding up the skull from inside, allowing it for later communication with its body and potentially another body. Internally, there are several things happening within this creature. It appears that in some ways the marker pushes some extra bone growth, usually in others, and they will fuse with the bodies of fallen friends to form a much stronger variant, and in still others, it appears the digestive system is overhauled to become things like the pukers. All use a potential pre-existing trait that is then capitalized on, such as like when twins become stalkers. As it said, twins potentially have a supernatural bond, like telepathically. In the case of the Divider, the musculature and skeletal systems are left alone, which is fairly interesting, as that's not usually what happens. Because of this, the tissue needed to bolster the intestinal systems. This has kind of left the creature incredibly lanky. And let's be real, there are manlets and there are lanklets, and this is a lanklet. But what is interesting is the noise that it is still able to produce. The creature will let out a wail when finding prey that is deep and throaty. Because of this, we can assume that the diaphragm is still intact and the lungs are still functional, if not for the only purpose of creating a sound, which comes out of the altered diaphragm. Another thing to note is that the Divider is what is known as a macro colony. The macro colony is simply a collection of components, as they are called, that come together to form this creature, which opens up the possibility for variations in what we have discussed. When looking at the Divider, it is clear that this thing is essentially just a torso with legs only partially attached to this point, and considering the spine is also severed, the pelvis is no longer there as well. So how did this happen? Well, there are two possibilities in my mind. When the officers were attacked, it is entirely possible that they were heavily dismembered. Their legs were cut off and their arms were cut off, their nose was cut off, their ears were cut off. Anyways, the head was also removed by the initial attack and the pelvis was removed. And this would have left them in pieces all scattered around, and that they would become their own organisms as directed by the marker. It is also possible, because they all came from the same person, that these pieces were nearby and rejoined with the body, having tendrils instead entered the torso of the abdomen region as well as into the legs, using these intestines to form connections. If this is the case, then the person suffered a rather horrific end, likened to Isaac meeting his end by the hunter, which is incredibly possible. The other possibility is, as mentioned, the person was together the whole time, and then their own body began tearing off their limbs in order to create a macro colony, using the upper body as a base connection point so that the many pieces could function and move. From here, we have to ask ourselves why they are different from the rest of the variants. To this, we have to look at the human psychology and, in general, how we operate. Humans are nothing more than, for primal reasons in a lot of situations, we're gonna act like the aliens from Invader Zim. The tallest are in charge. Our leaders are on average taller than normal, as this activates a very ancient ape portion of our brain where a connection is made that says, hey, they're tall, they can protect the group better and look out for everyone, ergo they must be a leader. Now, this is not always the case, as all throughout history there have been shorter leaders as well, but the general rule of thumb is the taller they are, the more likely they are to be in a leadership position. This over time may have had a self-compounding effect on leaders now. People who exhibited leadership qualities may have been taller. As a result, they were put in charge. They would lead, have children who were tall, and then also have these leadership qualities. Those leaders would mingle with other leaders who were possibly taller, which in turn, over the course of millennia, meant that those who were taller would exhibit some sort of leadership skills. Now, this is wildly simplified, but you can kind of start to see how this would play out. On the Ishimura, those leaders who were tall and in officer positions would have the genes necessary for growth. As they were altered by the marker, it's possible these genes, for one reason or another, were activated in the specifically like the intestinal systems. It is known that taller people typically have longer small intestines, which anyhow, that's pretty cool fact, because they need more nutrition in order to grow like that. So as a result, the intestines are longer to glean more nutrition from the food that they eat. This is sort of like when you do gastric bypass, you kind of cut out a bunch of the stomach, and then I believe it can actually attach further along the small intestine tract so that you absorb less calories. But this overgrowth, more than what is considered normal based on genetic direction, may be why the Divider in general uses the intestines to control the body. And this is always something that will stick out in a person that the marker will utilize to its own gain. And in this case, it's the longer than average intestines that are utilized to control the limbs of the person without having to put resources forward to grow bones and muscle. The other negative factor that may push it to do this is taller people typically have more brittle bones than shorter people, as they are elongated and have more forces acting on them. And this may be seen to the marker as a detriment to just make a really tall slasher that is more easily destroyed, and as such, it does not go forward with a typical slasher build. So speaking of macro colony, what does that mean exactly? Well, I'm glad you asked. You're pretty smart, and if you didn't ask, too bad we're talking about it. A macro colony, composed of components, as they are called, mean that it isn't just one creature, but several wearing a trench coat trying to get into an R-rated movie. Upon causing enough damage to this creature, it will abandon the facade and break into several pieces, each being a part of a limb. This may lend credence to the fact that this person was horrifically dismembered and reassembled, but again, it is unknown if this is actually what happened. Once it has fallen apart, the hands and feet will operate much like a lizard's tail. Their purpose is to break off and distract the aggressor so that it does not go after the real threat, which is the head. In an effort to distract, the hands and feet will launch themselves at Isaac and do minimal damage, but damage nonetheless. This is enough to stagger a full-grown man and get past heavy layers of cloth and some metal, meaning that to an unarmored person, this would likely cause bleeding and broken bones. While a person is focused on these smaller attacks, the head will move into a better position where it will jump onto a person and wrap around their neck. Arguably at this point, for anyone not wearing armor, this would be an immediate game over. But for Isaac, the armor gives some kind of resistance against it. I imagine because of how it is able to do this, and what we'll see later, there is actually some sort of serrated bone on the tendril that it uses to slide back and forth to get into the neck meat. If Isaac is quick enough, he can rip it off of his neck and smack the creature a few times, scrambling the brains inside and incapacitating it. However, if he's in a weakened state, the sharp bone will be able to break through the armor because he's not able to pull it off his neck, and it kind of just gets into the neck. From here, it is quickly able to cut through the meat of the neck and then into the spine and spinal column. The head quickly comes off at this point, leaving the body in a very much still living state for a few moments, while Isaac goes into shock as he's just a head on the floor. The creature will then use the tendrils it has to dig into the spinal column, where assumedly a connection with its own brain is made, and that means it's able to interface with the body of Isaac, and it's able to shakily walk off, turning him into an armed threat that we will see in Dead Space 3 a lot of times. This connection is haphazard at best and unsteady, but is still a very real threat, and likely over time the head will fuse into the body more readily as it's converted by the marker, giving it more and more control. And it is possible from here another divider will be created, or it may be even that the divided turns into these elongated security officers that we will see being like a combination of a regular person and a divider. The other possibility the divider has at its disposal is to just straight up take you out while it's in its macro form. It will use its esophagus to wrap around Isaac's neck, and once getting past that armor, it'll tighten and pull, severing the connection between anxiety meat and meat suit, likely turning Isaac into either the corruption or causing him to meet the same fate as the divider and becoming one himself. It is largely unknown what really happens after this point. But the Divider is an absolutely horrifying creature due to the fact that it's big, scary, and gray. Well, sort of anyhow. I mean, there is some, I guess, pink meat all over its body, but the tendrils are pretty freaky and they are pink. However, with a steady hand and plenty of animosity for all things Necromorph, you can come out on top as long as you aren't distracted by hand creatures running around trying to get your attention. As has been said online in reference to when these creatures grab you, so, no head? But anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, then leaving a like is greatly appreciated as it gets the video out there and into the algorithm, and subscribing is a great way to stay up to date on what I post. I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, and channel links in the description for all those interested. Speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. First, huge thank you to our astronaut, Rosie Kinks. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank our astrophysicist, Desk Dancer, as well as our scientists, Argent Sentinel, Chad the Enjoyer of Scientific Explanations of B-grade horror movies, Logan Satome, Lucian Dragon, Robbie Cruz, and Tyson Nakanishi. And to the rest of my patrons, I thank you guys as well. Your help goes a long way towards keeping everything running and is greatly appreciated. All right, so that's going to do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I'll see y'all in the next one.